Was the 2024 college football season the best we've ever seen? Well, in this video of College Football Talk, Peter Burtnett, I'm going to be going over the season as a whole, kind of the storyline as it went throughout the 2024 season, some of the key moments, key games, and then also getting some outside opinion from a couple of friends of mine who are very much into college football and will be giving their thoughts on what they thought was the story of the season, the surprise of the season, and the disappointment of the season. But before I get into it, if you go on to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I upload. But starting things out, the story of the season, well, it started out in week 0 when Florida State came crashing down early. It started with obviously the backstory from this team being 13-0, left out of the college football playoff last year, ACC champions, to what ended up being one of the worst fall-offs in the history of college football. I'll talk more about that in depth later, but that week 0 loss in Dublin to Georgia Tech seemed like a good college football upset. It didn't seem like there was a lot under the surface brewing for Florida State. It seemed like, these Yellow Jackets, they beat Miami last year. They're a pretty solid team. Boston College then in week 1 on Monday night definitely added some more questions. And then when Memphis beat them, then it was like, oh wow, what is going on with the Seminoles? So that kind of got things started off early, kind of along the lines of upsets. I'm going to be going over kind of some categories of sorting through these. To me, the biggest one was Northern Illinois over then number 5 Notre Dame in South Bend. Now, the Fighting Irish have lost a couple in South Bend recently to highly teams that are strong underdogs to teams that are highly unfavored, I guess. In this one, there were a couple of blocked field goals, and it proved to be the most massive one because, to me, the Ohio State loss to Michigan wasn't so much of a big upset. I'll talk more about that one later here. But this one was the biggest upset. It's against the national runner-up in their home stadium after they had just gone on the road and gotten a win over a solid Texas A&M team. So that's the biggest one. To me, the most embarrassing loss is number 6 Ole Miss at home to Kentucky. This game was in Oxford. The Rebels just had no offense in this game. Now, that's a credit to Mark Stoops and the Wildcats' defense at Kentucky. But overall, you got a quarterback like Jackson Dart, and I think in this game they put up 13 points. That's just honestly unacceptable, and it really is probably the most embarrassing one. The best upset, though, was Vanderbilt Commodores and Diego Pavia getting the upset over number 1 Alabama. The Commodores before this game had been 0-60 against number 1 ranked teams. And Pavia, who really was just a lightning rod for excitement this season and very much up and down for Vandy this year. They lose to Georgia State, and then they go and beat the number 1 Crimson Tide at the time at home. So that's the best upset, I think. I think there's just so much excitement and just emotion with that one. Then there was one team that was the masters of the upset this year, and that was the Kansas Jayhawks. They had wins over teams that were, when they beat them, number 17 Iowa State, number 6 BYU, and number 16 Colorado. And they nearly had 4 straight. Before that run of 3 got started, they lost 29-27 to Kansas State, who was also ranked at the time that they lost to them. So Kansas they were the kings of the upset this year. And it was a lot of fun to see that. I hope, Jalen Daniels is back and healthy next year and they can kind of get things rolling and compete in the Big 12. Then finally, rounding out the category of upsets, there's this stunning and inexplicable one. And this one was Michigan over then number 2 Ohio State. Now, this was also somehow exactly what Ohio State needed to go on the national championship run. But it was also, it was just watching that game as somebody who obviously is a Buckeye fan, just like what is going on, the play calling, the way that just couldn't get anything going on offense, defense played very well in that game, and Michigan just ended up, their defense strung together without some of their key guys like Will Johnson and shut down the Ohio State offense that, of course, ran the ball a lot. So this was the stunning and inexplicable one. That rivalry, the game, is always going to have those chances for upsets, but this one was stunning. Then, going over some of the best games this season, to me, it probably has to start out. Now, this is the ones that had big impact on the college football playoff. I'm not going to go over, except for one game actually, ones that were just overall good games. Week 5, number 4 Alabama over number 2 Georgia, 41-34. Now, this was the one that the Crimson Tide went on a huge wave, pun intended there, to go ahead massively at the break. And Georgia comes fighting back. The Bulldogs clawed all the way back to tie the game. And then Ryan Williams has that, or maybe they even went ahead. I'm trying to remember what the score was at the time. But either way, Ryan Williams then goes up for a catch, spins as he's coming down, and then spins again to lose a couple of defenders and speeds down the sideline. The talented 17-year-old freshman that we all heard about. This was really his main moment. Now, Jeremiah Smith, I think, outshone him because of what he did throughout the season and obviously in the college football playoff. But Ryan Williams will be a wide receiver who's going to be a lot of fun to watch, and this was kind of his moment. Week 7, just 2 weeks later, number 3 Oregon over number 2 Ohio State, 32-31. This one had 8 lead changes. It was all around good football. Both teams were extremely well balanced. At the end, there was some bad clock management, and I think this was probably, because of their relative lack of success, especially in championship games, but even in the college football playoff, this was what I think is probably the Ducks' biggest win in program history. Now, it didn't amount to much. They're still waiting for the ultimate big one, which would be in a national championship game. They've won a semifinal before, but they lost to Auburn in 2010, then they lost to Ohio State in 2014, and then, of course, the Rose Bowl loss this year in the quarterfinals to the Buckeyes. So this Oregon team, though, this was their moment. Again, it's kind of raises that question: is it their biggest upset ever or biggest win ever? It wasn't really much of an upset. I think it probably is, and it also is up there with some of the best games in Autzen Stadium. Now, here's the fun one: in Week 14, the Pac-2 championship game. The two, the old guard now, so to speak, of Oregon State and Washington State battle it out. Washington State was number 25 at the time. Washington State had a good season up to that point. They were ranked, and Oregon State pulls out a 41-38 win. So just kind of a cool moment there for the two teams remaining in the Pac-2 conference. Then in the college football playoff, obviously we know that there were games that weren't exactly close. I mean, most of the first round games, apart from kind of Notre Dame and Indiana, but really the Fighting Irish were in control after Jeremiah Love's 98-yard rushing touchdown to get things started. Indiana made things a little bit closer later, really just kind of made the score look a little bit more flattering for them. But where things did get exciting was in the Peach Bowl. This was the Scadaboo show. I mean, how about Cam Scadaboo? I'll probably talk about him a little bit more later, but he had an incredible game, and this one even had a passing touchdown, and I think over 200 yards rushing, certainly over like 150. The Texas defense, they had been ahead comfortably in this one, and then in the second overtime, they finally make a stand defensively with Andrew Mukuba's interception to earn a 39-31 win. Then in the semifinal round, you've obviously got the Orange Bowl. You've got number 3 Notre Dame getting a 27-24 win over number 4 Penn State. The Irish went back to the national championship game for the first time in 12 years, and they sealed it on a late Christian Gray interception. This was overall just kind of a well-played game. Similarly, in the Cotton Bowl, that game between Ohio State and Texas was more of a defensive showcase. It wasn't the most entertaining game ever, but it probably has arguably the top moment from the college football season this year with Captain Jack Sawyer's scoop and score, 82 yards through the eyes of Texas to put the Buckeyes ahead by 2 touchdowns and send them to the national championship game. And then, of course, the Ohio State Buckeyes finished it off to win the national championship. I think that is probably the story of the season. I might be a bit partial here because of, being from the state of Ohio and growing up as a Buckeye fan, but you lose to your biggest rival. And I talked about this more in my last video or 2 videos ago now. That was kind of a recap of the Ohio State season, kind of their path to the title and then the key players. So if you want to check that out, I'll link that in the description, or I'll have it pop up here at some point or maybe at the end of this video. But to be able to come back from that loss, and even to avenge the Oregon loss too, and to come back from the loss to Michigan, to just rattle off 4 straight double-digit wins that really, aside from, a good part of that Texas game, really, they weren't in complete control, but they were ahead ahead or tied for the entirety of that game. And then against Notre Dame, they really just answered that early drive and held off a late charge. I mean, they were dominant. Let's just put it simply in the college football playoff. So I think that's probably the story of the season. Now, before I get into my surprise and disappointment of the season, I'm going to send it over to my friends Joe and Noah, and they're going to be giving their story and surprise and disappointment of the season. So here they go.
Hello, College Football Talk fans and viewers. My name is Joe Staten. I'm Peter's friend from high school, now also cousin-in-law, believe it or not. But my submission today is going to be focused on a couple different things. First of all, the surprise this season. A team and player that surprised me, Ashton Jeanty, obviously. Many of you guys know him, but Boise State was on the scene. It was really cool to see them come up and be on the scene this year, have a run in the playoffs, have a chance to compete for a title. I think that's one of the cool things that the 12-team playoff does. It allows teams like that probably would never get in a 4-team playoff to compete. Didn't have the best ending to the season, but nonetheless cool to see them perform. A player, a standout story, a special story, was TreVeyon Henderson. All right, I'm a Michigan fan. You all know that if you know me, but really appreciate TreVeyon Henderson's focus this year on faith, but also had a great season and positioned himself to be a very high pick in the NFL draft. Came back after adversity after losing to Michigan. Will say he lost every year to Michigan, so I'm not gonna pound too hard on that line of thinking. Spare some of the Ohio State fans some pain. But very impressive season from TreVeyon Henderson, and not surprising to anybody at all if you know me. Like I said, disappointment. Michigan. You can't. How do you go from being preseason, I think we were top 12, to finishing out of the playoffs, not even close, didn't have a quarterback? I will say Davis Warren did make a run at the end of the season, had some pretty good games as a leader especially, won the big game in Columbus, but still a disappointing season for the Wolverines. So those are my 3 submissions. Hope y'all watch the rest of the video. Shout out to you, Peter.
The 2024 college football season was one of the greatest college football seasons I've ever seen. I've been watching CFB for probably 11 years now. I started in 2013 after becoming a fan of the Ohio State Buckeyes. And out of all the seasons of college football that I've watched, this one has been the best one without a doubt. There were so many good games, so many big-time upsets, and so many marquee matchups. And I feel like that defines the 2024 season, is the amount of big hype matchups that we saw this season. A lot of people came into the year worried that realignment and the new TV deals and all that was going to ruin college football, but that didn't happen. There were so many big-time matchups that I can think of that weren't possible except for realignment. Ohio State and Oregon, Georgia and Texas, in the SEC championship game as well, Texas and Texas A&M. There were so many incredible games this season that had a lot of hype surrounding them that would have never happened if realignment didn't take place. There were also tons of massive games like Vanderbilt and Alabama, Georgia and Alabama, Ohio State, Oregon. Just so many good games in college football that came down to the wire this season. It was super fun to watch each and every one of them every week, because every week you sat down and there had to be a fantastic college football game that was taking place. And also the 12-team playoff, that was a huge success. It gave teams the opportunity to have a second chance, a rebound, kind of like the national champion Ohio State Buckeyes. They had 2 losses in the season, Oregon and Michigan, but they were able to bounce back. That 8 seed, they went through the playoff and they won the national championship. But also teams like Notre Dame that may or may not have gotten in if it was the 4-team bracket. You got teams like Indiana, SMU, Boise State getting an opportunity. Even if they lost their very first games, they were still in the biggest games of their entire program's history. And home playoff games are incredible. The atmospheres at those home games were fantastic. We need more home playoff games. That's what everybody in college football agrees with. In my opinion, the biggest surprise of the 2024 season was the Ohio Bobcats. If you remember before the season, they lost tons of transfers. Their starting quarterback, Curtis Rourke, transferred to Indiana. They were projected to finish 6-6 this season. And they had a bit of a rough start to the year, but they turned it on at the end of the year. Parker Navarro, the quarterback, played at, dare I say, a Heisman level. Coleman Owen, star wide receiver, fantastic season, broke out of nowhere. the Bobcats won the MAC championship, got their first 11-win season in program history. It was the most unexpected thing that a lot of people just did not see coming. And I know a lot of people want to talk about the Indianas and the SMUs of the world, but the Ohio Bobcats, man, not a lot of people talk about them, but man, what a season for them. And meanwhile, the biggest disappointment of the season, it's got to be Florida State. 12-1 last season. They were undefeated. They got left out of the 4-team playoff. A big reason why we needed the 12-team playoff. A lot of people thought now they can't get screwed over by the committee. And then they finished 2-10 this season. DJU played awful football, fired both their coordinators. It was just a complete disaster for Florida State, and it was pretty funny watching that unfold over the course of the season. But yeah, that's my opinion on the 2024 college football season. One of the best seasons in recent college football history. Is it better than 2007? Probably not, but all this chaos and craziness is fantastic for the sport. Let's just hope it stays this way and that nothing big happens to completely ruin college football. But so far, the new stuff is pretty good.
Thanks, Peter. I would say definitely coming from an Ohio State perspective, the biggest surprise of the season was honestly Boise State. I don't really follow the Mountain West or anything like that. So, maybe their fans saw this coming, but the fact that they even made the CFP is pretty impressive, and obviously Genty was a huge part of that. You could say biggest surprise was him not winning the Heisman. I think he probably should have. The biggest story for me was absolutely just the 2024 Ohio State season. I mean, the highs and the lows, the playoff run was insane. I thought we were probably going to get past Tennessee, maybe got our revenge against Oregon, but the way we just clobbered them was absolutely... I could even say that was the biggest surprise for me was how we responded to the Michigan loss. But you could also say it's not that surprising because it lit a fire under our butts. So I would say Ohio State's season is the biggest story. Biggest disappointment, Michigan loss. Obviously it worked out in the end, but fourth in a row at home to a team that was, looking mediocre, would have ended up with a close to 500 record. That's just unacceptable. So, and also biggest disappointment was my reaction to that in, trying to get Ryan Day fired, or at least calling for them to consider it. So a little disappointed in myself for that. Obviously, he proved himself worthy of the job, and he'll always be a Buckeye. So, that pretty much sums up my response to the season. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe and Noah. Yeah, it was certainly a great season. I loved Travion Henderson, of course, his faith, just, wearing that on his sleeve. I think Michigan, you could argue that's a disappointment. I think it's probably a little bit expected, especially and the way they ended the season too. It's hard to look at that as too much of a disappointment, but as a Michigan fan, I'm sure you do, Joe. And and Noah, your Bobcats were incredible. Curtis Rourke going to Indiana and playing the way that he did, and then Parker Navarro steps in and leads you guys to the MAC championship. As somebody who spent a semester at a branch campus of Ohio University, I can also say OU. Oh yeah. So great season for them. And then I'm gonna follow you right up, Noah, too, with I'm gonna start with my biggest disappointment, I guess. That has to be Florida State. Their drop off of minus 11 wins, going from 13-1 last year to 2-10. There's only been one team in college football history that has had a worse drop off. That was 2011 Southern Miss to 2012. They were 12-0 the season before. And then after a coaching change, they dropped to 0-12. So that is a pretty incredible, in a bad way, turnaround. Florida State ranked among the worst offenses in college football, with Kent State, who is probably the worst team in all of FBS this season. What happened there? Maybe it goes back to players sitting out for the bowl game. I think the Orange Bowl against Georgia last year, and just getting trounced. But a lot of those guys were gone from the team, not even playing. But I don't know, maybe the guys who were playing as backups, maybe it's the culture there. Mike Norvell is a pretty good coach, but certainly wasn't this year. So Florida State is certainly the biggest disappointment. And then the biggest surprise, it's hard to pick either one of these teams, so I'm just going to give it to Arizona State and Indiana. I know that's the obvious choice. Some people might say SMU. I don't think SMU is a huge surprise. I think the way they played in the ACC was slightly surprising, but I had them around 8 or 9 wins this season. So yes, they took it a couple steps further, but you look at Arizona State and Indiana, I think both of those teams I projected to have a combined like 8 wins, if even that good. And instead, they both go and win. What did they end up with? Like 11 wins each? And Arizona State wins the Big 12 championship. I mean, those two teams, let's just talk about them a little bit. Arizona State goes with plus 8 wins. Indiana actually matched them as well. Kenny Dillingham was delightful as a head coach, very animated throughout the season. His reaction when that BYU game, that was one that was up there. And let me just put an aside right here. A 14-team playoff, you're not afforded that opportunity for that game to be interesting. With a 12-team playoff, it's very interesting because the winner of that game you knew was going to be a good position to play for the Big 12 championship. The fans storm the field. They think Arizona State's already won, and then they put a second or a couple seconds back on the clock and run one more play, and then they storm the field again. And Dillingham was just completely animated during part of that sequence when he found out. And how about Cam Skatta? Boom. Very similar to Cody Schrader last year at Missouri. He just put this Sun Devils team on his back. I know there are a lot of other guys that are worth a mention, but I mean, he nearly, if it wasn't for Ashton Genty at Boise State and the incredible two-way star Travis Hunter at Colorado, he would have been in the running for the Heisman Trophy. And he kind of was, but I think he would have been a finalist if not for one of those guys, really. And how about both of those guys? Joe, I can agree with you that Ashton Genty was a surprise, but I think just how good he was in like historic fashion. Only Barry Sanders, I think, has had a better season than he had. But I think Boise State was kind of the team that we expected to be among the favorites, if not maybe the favorite, to be the group of 5 representative in the playoffs. So, I do agree that just how good Genty was is worth a mention here, but I think it kind of falls in that SMU category that we expected those teams to be good. We did not expect what Arizona State did, and what a season for the Sun Devils. Then, of course, Indiana, plus 8 wins as well. The Sig 10, I mean, of course, he had the loss to Ohio State, but won every other game in the Big 10 this season, lost just one game, the college football playoff first round game to Notre Dame. So, I mean, an 11-2 season for the Hoosiers, and your only losses are to the 2 teams that reached the national championship game. That's incredible. Curtis Rourke I wrote down here a resurgence, but he was pretty good at OU. So I would just say he just, really burst onto the scene more than he did, on the MAC stage. He did it at the Big Ten as well. And this Indiana team, Kurt Cignetti brought over a lot of guys from James Madison. I'm not sure how many of those guys are going to be gone next year, but it'll be interesting to see for the Hoosiers. I think I hesitate. I really hope both of these two teams aren't one-hit wonders. It would be really cool to see these teams, competing year in and year out. So I'm not going to make any proclamations here about what I expect, but let's just say I hope that both of these teams can reproduce a little bit of this magic. So, that is the rundown. A couple of other honorable mentions. Obviously, like I said, SMU and Boise State. Illinois finishing with 10 wins. Syracuse adding Kyle McCord. They had a really good season. I think they ended with 10 wins. Fran Brown is leading that program in the right direction. Brett Bielema over at Illinois. Iowa State, their first ever 10-win season in program history, and they went and did one better by beating Miami in one of the best bowl games in the Pop-Tarts Bowl, coming back in that one to get a win. So shout out to the Cyclones for getting 11 wins for the first time also. And then Notre Dame as well. I think, we expected them to be a playoff team, but we've seen them disappoint so much in the big games. And they also, like Ohio State, are kind of a mention for, story of the season, the way they came back from that loss to NIU. I think the Fighting Irish, they've got the best young head coach. I think Dan Lanning at Oregon is right there, but Marcus Freeman is up there with the best coaches in college football. And I think at this point, you don't even need the disclaimer of young coach. He is one of the best coaches in college football. And the fact that they were able to make that run to get to the championship game, I think was a little bit of a surprise. So that's all. A lot of thoughts, kind of a little bit all over the place in this video, but it was an incredible season of college football. To answer my question at the beginning, if you're looking for chaos, 2007 still has this season beat, but 2007 was also the last time a 2-loss team won the national championship. That was LSU that year, so maybe that tells you a little something about how chaotic it was this season. I mean, a lot of good upsets. Vanderbilt is right back there. Clark Lee did a phenomenal job coaching there. I mean, I could probably go over, maybe I will, like a conference-by-conference breakdown of the 2024 season, but I do feel like I covered a lot of bases here. So let me know in the comments below what your top moment was from the season, your top upset, the best story, the one that really brought you in, maybe inspired you or surprised you, the team that burst onto the scene, and then which team you thought was the biggest disappointment. Maybe there's another one outside of Florida State. They're the obvious choice, but comment below your thoughts on the 2024 season, and I guess a special shout out as well to Travis Hunter for winning the Heisman Trophy. I didn't feature him as much on the channel just because Colorado wasn't really in the CFP conversation because of their early losses, but a good season for the Buffaloes, and it's cool that it looks like Deion Sanders is going to be staying there, even with Shedeur and Travis Hunter going on to the NFL. So thank you all so much for taking the time to watch College Football Talk, both this video and the videos throughout this season. I'm really excited for the 2025 season. I'll have plenty of videos uploading Mondays and perhaps even more often as we get our eyes turned towards next season. But again, this is Peter Burtnett, College Football Talk, signing out. Peace.